My name is Zach Pagan, and I am a senior fellow affiliated with IPD, in addition to being a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington, D.C. Nearly 1 month ago, Ukraine's armed forces launched a surprise incursion into Russia's Kursk region. Yet if the purpose of this attack was to force Russia to divert its forces away from Ukraine's Donbass region, then it appears to have failed. With Ukraine having likely committed 10 to 15,000 troops to its Kursk offensive, its defensive lines in the Donbass have now become embrittled. As a result, the pace of Russian gains in the Donbass has picked up, and Russian forces are now situated just a few kilometers outside the crucial Ukrainian logistics hub of Pokrovsk. Here to unpack what all of this means for the future of war and peace, not just in Ukraine, but also across the region, we are fortunate to have with us two of Washington's most renowned and thoughtful Russia watchers. Thomas Graham is Distinguished Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and was Special Assistant to the President of the United States and Senior Director for Russia on the National Security Council staff from 2004 to 2007. Welcome, Tom.
Glad to be here.
And Eugene Rumer is Director and Senior Fellow at the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and was the National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the U.S. National Intelligence Council from 2010 to 2014. Gene, thanks so much for being here with us as well.
Thanks.
And to both of you, allow me to say that I've been very fortunate to benefit from your wisdom and insights on many an occasion, and our audience is lucky to be able to do so today as well. So thank you both for joining us here today on IPD's platform. And to our audience, please pose your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to get to some of them a little later on in today's program. Let's get started. Tom, let me start with you. Ukraine's Kursk offensive looks like a departure from its strategy of wearing down Russian manpower through attrition, even if this comes at the cost of minor territorial losses for Ukraine. So what exactly, in your view, was President Zelensky thinking in launching an incursion into Russia proper and departing from that attrition strategy? Was this a military logic? Was it a political logic? Help us walk through that.
Well, look, I think there was a little bit of both to them. You already mentioned one, Zach, and that is the hope that the Kursk incursion would draw Russian forces away from the front lines in the Donbass region in particular. As you already noted, that does not appear to have been the case. Zelensky has also said that one of the goals was to create a buffer zone to push Russian forces farther away to protect territory in Ukraine from attack by Russian artillery, rockets, air power. Whether that is in fact the case is something that we'll have to see in the future. So there were some military calculations to it, but I think the more important was probably the political. I think that Zelensky was interested in changing the narrative about the conflict. If you read the Western press, certainly the overwhelming attitude was that Ukraine was slowly being worn down, that this was a losing proposition for Ukraine over the long run, if not necessarily in the short term. And Zelensky wanted to demonstrate that the Ukrainians were capable of offensive operations. And taking this into Russia opens up a new dimension to the conflict, perhaps creates a bargaining chip for future negotiation, but also has the political aspect of being a public humiliation for Putin himself, who has talked about the advances of the Russian forces, the progress they're making on the ground, has always talked about negotiations that would take into account the current geopolitical realities, so that the narrative will have to shift because of what Ukraine has done in Kursk. So those, I think, political and military, were two things that were on Zelensky's mind. Whether he's going to succeed, of course, that is the question that we're going to answer in the next several months, I would imagine.
Thanks, Tom. You mentioned the potential of using territory as a bargaining chip. So, Gene, let me turn to you. Presumably, the taking of territory inside Russia is only a useful bargaining chip if you can hold that territory. And even though Ukraine is currently trying to set up a defensible perimeter, it's far from certain that Ukraine will ultimately be able to do that, to hold on to that territory. Alternatively, if Kyiv's goal was to revive Western political support for its cause, it's hard to see how that will happen if it continues to lose territory in the Donbass as a result of this incursion. So, can you give us your sense of what you think Zelensky's logic might have been here?
Well, I very much agree with Tom's assessment. And again, thank you for inviting me to speak here. I do believe that creating something to trade with was probably part of Zelensky's strategy in deciding to capture this piece of Russian territory. But I am very skeptical that this creates the necessary conditions for a negotiation between Kyiv and Moscow about ending the conflict on terms that might be favorable to Ukraine. First, of course, the Russian offensive in the Donetsk region continues, and that, in terms of the overall strategy in this war, seems to be more important than the territory that Ukraine has been able to carve out in the Kursk region. That's one. Two, assuming Ukraine can hold this territory for the time being, I find it extremely difficult to imagine that Putin will now say, okay, this really hurts. I have to negotiate. It is, I believe, as Tom, you said, an extremely humiliating development for Putin, who just a little over a year ago attended the old battlefield near Kursk to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the victory at the Kursk battle, that in the Russian, previously Soviet, but also Russian historiography, paved the way for the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany. So that place has particular symbolic value to the Kremlin's official narrative. So now that he has suffered this humiliating incursion and loss of significant territory, I find it very difficult to believe that Putin will say, all right, now it's time to negotiate. After all, he is someone who inserted that apocryphal story about a cornered rat in one of his earlier biographies, in which he wrote that, when a rat is cornered, the rat strikes back even harder. And given that the overall picture in this war still seems to be favoring Russia rather than Ukraine, he probably can afford to just let this slide, so to speak, or let it be, without devoting significant forces, resources to recapturing this territory. And in the meantime, he's conducting his horrific campaign, as we saw today, with a massive strike at Poltava. That's the last I've seen, and unfortunately it's probably more now, but the count of dead and wounded was climbing, with over 200 wounded and maybe close to 50 dead. So that the Kursk incursion, to my mind, doesn't really change the narrative of this war significantly, unfortunately, in the strategic picture. So it could be a morale boost for Ukraine, and certainly is for the Ukrainian troops. But again, it's a tactical victory that doesn't change the overall picture.
Got it. Thank you for that, Gene. Tom, let me go back to you. The mainstream narrative is that Western support for Ukraine increases when the Ukrainian armed forces are making gains, and it tends to flag when it looks as though the Ukrainian armed forces are engaged in a hopeless cause. But how much do you think that President Zelensky has possibly calculated that the West might meet Ukrainian losses in the Donbass with more support due to the sunk cost fallacy?
Well, I don't think that that's going to make much of a difference at all in the calculations in the West. The Western leaders, I think, have more or less decided on what the course of this conflict is going to look like. They're hoping for a stalemate. They don't believe that there is a real possibility for substantial Ukrainian gains on the ground in the near term, no matter what type of equipment is provided to the Ukrainians. That at this point. The best the Ukrainians can do is hold the line. The incursion into Kursk is not going to change that calculation. I also believe that the West has included that it's unlikely that the Russians are going to make a major breakthrough that is going to change the overall dynamic of this conflict in the near term. I have seen nothing over the past month that has suggested that we're seeing a recalculation in major Western capitals, certainly not in the United States. In fact, if you look at the media reporting, it's fairly balanced as to the pluses and minuses of the Kursk incursion. And if you look at the political debate here in the United States, well, we're focused on something else rather than Ukraine right now, into a presidential election. And I would imagine you're going to see some talk about Ukraine, but it's certainly not going to be a dominant theme between now and November 5th.
Got it. Thank you. Gene, back to you. You mentioned Russia feeling as if time is generally on its side. From what we can gather, people in Russia seem to be somewhat worried over Ukraine's Kursk incursion, but not as worried as they were in the fall of 2022, when the regime conducted a partial military mobilization of the population. That's when worries and polling among the population seemed to spike. So if part of Ukraine's logic was to use the invasion of Kursk to give Putin a political headache, that doesn't necessarily seem to have worked. So my question for you, therefore, is, as long as Putin does not conduct a full-scale mobilization, and if he continues to rely on a strategy focused on attriting Ukrainian forces, what other forces are there that could really hamper Putin in Ukraine at this point? Is it, the economy running hot inside Russia? Is it, Russia running out of military stockpiles? Give us your sense.
Well, the short answer to your question, Zach, I don't know. I don't see anything in the domestic political context in Russia, be it among the elite or the general public, that would amount to a significant push or demand on Putin to end this war. You could even make the case that the incursion underscores for the public at large, magnified through Russian propaganda, the point that Ukraine really does present a security problem for Russia. And the narrative that I have observed in the domestic political context in Russia is such that it paints Putin's decision to go to war, full-scale war, and be clear about that, in 2022 as the right decision, because you see, Ukraine poses a problem, and if Putin hadn't done what he did in 2022, we would have been even worse off today. So, I sense, I have an impression that the Russian public is somewhere between being indifferent and, for the most part, indifferent, but also angry at the government for not doing a good enough job at conducting this war. We've seen a lot of that actually in reporting from the Kursk region and also other parts of Russia, with people complaining that we've spent so much money on defense, and it turns out now that all these generals are crooks and thieves. By the way, in the last few months, there's not a week that's gone by when a senior Russian military officer was not arrested on charges of corruption, with numbers of alleged, bribes and misdeeds running into tens of millions of rubles. So the Russian public right now probably does not have a very favorable view of their country's military leadership. But again, somehow Putin is insulated and is above it all. I have yet to see, to the extent that we can believe such public opinion data that we can see, his standing is still quite high in the domestic political context. And as you said yourself, the economy is perhaps overheating, but so far Putin's capable, let's call them, team of economic enablers of this war has done very well managing the economy in very difficult circumstances. Well, I mean, they've kept the economy going.
Got it. Tom, let me come back to you on that question of potential political headaches for Putin. Does it matter for him where the front line is? Does it embarrass him at all that there are Ukrainian armed forces that are potentially difficult to dislodge on sovereign Russian territory? Or really is the more important goal for him just, eventually wearing down Ukrainian morale and, eventually producing regime change, potentially leading to a more Russia-friendly government in Ukraine, if something like that is even still conceivable? Now after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and by pursuing regime change, not only determining the geostrategic orientation of Ukraine, but effectively rewriting the rules of European security. Is he really just more focused on that big picture and everything else is fluff?
Well, I mean, he is focused on the big picture, but he is, I mean, as Gene had pointed out, I mean, he is embarrassed by what has happened in Kursk. And he certainly doesn't want to end up in a situation where Ukraine occupies a part of Russian territory for a long period. But I think the calculation inside the Kremlin is that we can push forward on Donetsk at this point, achieve one of the goals that Putin stated several months ago of liberating all the territory from the regions that they have illegally annexed into Russia. Donetsk is a big part of that. So that is a significant achievement. I'm sure the betting in the Kremlin is that eventually we can push the Ukrainians out of Kursk. That's not something we need to do immediately. It'll be very difficult for the Ukrainians to sustain this over the long run, particularly as they lose territory in the east and in the south. So I think he is focused on the big picture. The important point now is not to panic, not to overreact to what has happened in Kursk, to keep your sight on what it is you're trying to achieve, and keep pushing forward on that. And that's exactly what he's doing at this point. Let me just build on one other thing that Gene said on the popular side. In fact, if you look at the opinion polls, I think Levada had a poll out within the past week that indicated the number of Russians who are pushing for, say that they would approve of negotiations to end the conflict at this point, has decreased because of the after the Kursk invasion. So there is very little public pressure inside Russia to end this conflict anytime soon. I'm sure Putin doesn't feel much pressure at all.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you to those audience members who have already begun to pose their questions in the Q&A function. We will get to those shortly. But first, I want to ask you both about escalation risks, our next topic. Ukraine, understandably, wants to take the fight to Russia's territory, given that Russia has invaded Ukraine and currently occupies roughly 20% of Ukraine. But that is also obviously a move that is fraught with risk for the security of the entire continent. And so there's a real sense that Ukraine and the West don't necessarily agree on how the war should be prosecuted, and to say nothing of the question of what the end game should be, which of course isn't necessarily something that Western countries have fully articulated themselves at this point, even though we're 2.5 years in. So if Ukraine's incentive structure, Gene, views the risks of escalation as vastly more acceptable than the West's incentive structure at this point, can you help our audience to understand to what extent Western and Ukrainian interests remain aligned 2.5 years into this war?
Let me just say a word first about escalation risks. Brings to mind the argument that one hears these days that, look, Ukrainians have crossed many, many red lines. We have crossed many, many red lines, and the Russians have not reacted. So there is no risk of escalation. Russians have no red lines. Therefore, we should be doing more to support Ukraine and so on. My view is that just because we don't know where those red lines are, or just because Ukraine has crossed them without consequences, doesn't mean that they don't exist. If you're talking about sort of continent-wide risks, you probably are referring to nuclear escalation. I believe that the risk exists, but the risk has diminished significantly since the fall of 2022, when the Russian army was truly in a dire situation, and the Ukrainian troops were poised to achieve a major breakthrough. I would say that the risk of escalation is connected. It just depends on the overall situation on the battlefield and the risk of nuclear escalation. And right now, the war is not going badly for Russia. So I don't see a major risk of nuclear escalation in response to the incursion into Kursk. The Russian army continues to kind of grind away slowly but surely, more and more, capturing more and more Ukrainian territory. So Kursk doesn't really change that. That said, do our interests being broadly defined as those of the West, are the same as those of Ukraine? Again, broadly speaking, I believe yes. I don't think that it is in the interest of the West to see Ukraine defeated, lose major portion of its territory, and accept the terms that Putin has insisted on, which is basically demilitarization of the country, permanent ban on NATO membership, and so on. No, I think it would be a humiliating defeat for the West and would put in danger our allies in Europe as well. But then we get into the kind of gray area of how long, how far do we want to prosecute this war? What constitutes the it in whatever it takes? And at this point, I think Tom referred to earlier to what is broadly accepted now among Western governments, and that is the fact that Ukraine is unlikely to recapture its lost territory. So framing the question of victory for Ukraine is not necessarily the same as framing it in terms of recapturing the territory, but can Ukraine achieve peace on honorable terms so that it will be able to pursue its goal of European integration? I think NATO integration is a separate conversation. I frankly am very pessimistic about Ukraine's prospects for membership, but EU membership and Ukraine becoming integrated in Europe, that would be a major victory for Ukraine, and I think that could be certainly a win for the West.
Got it. Eugene, you mentioned that NATO's credibility, in effect, is at stake in this war, although Article 5 doesn't apply to Ukraine. Would you be able to clarify that a little bit more?
Well, I didn't say NATO's credibility, but you might say it that way. I would say, if I did, I didn't mean to. I think that, we have invested a lot in Ukraine in its victory. So for us to accept anything resembling the terms that Putin insists on, which amounts to basically a total capitulation of Ukraine, would be absolutely unacceptable. So yes, it would be, I think, fraught with dire consequences for the cohesion, for the alliance, for the EU, for the transatlantic link. Call it reputational damage, loss of prestige, loss of face, whatever. But it would be a major, also moral victory for Putin.
Do you agree?
Yeah, more or less, I agree that in broad terms, our interests are aligned with Ukraine. I think the fundamental problem that we have is that we don't have a definition of victory at this point that is readily accepted or is accepted broadly throughout the Western world and Ukraine. Everyone thinks in terms of the 1991 borders, and certainly that was Ukraine's definition of victory when it started this conflict. But 2.5 years in, as I've already said, it doesn't appear that Western capitals believe that regaining those 1991 borders through military action is possible in the near future. And I sense that there's also an understanding in Ukraine that getting back to those 1991 borders militarily is a difficult proposition. And so the question becomes, how are we going to define victory? Clearly, we don't want Ukraine to accede, or us to accede, what Putin's demands are on demilitarization, regime change in Ukraine, a formal recognition of the territory that Russia has seized. But what is it that we do want? How would we define victory? And I think you're beginning to see a serious sort of discussion of this at this point. What Eugene indicated is the pathway that I believe most Western governments are on, and probably Kyiv as well. That is preserving a independent Ukraine, sovereign Ukraine, on as broad as expanse of territory of pre-1991 Ukraine as possible, but then accelerating the integration of Ukraine into the Euro-Atlantic community. I think that is certainly possible on the economic side. This is where the EU accession talks are an important part of the political problem, and then also providing some sort of security arrangement that decreases the likelihood of further Russian military action against the Ukraine that it doesn't occupy at this point in the future. All of that is doable. To my mind, it's something that we need to focus more attention on, and we need to develop sort of a common understanding of what we're trying to achieve. That will give some purpose to the actions we're taking here in the United States, other Western countries, but also will give something for the Ukrainians themselves to focus on. And final point here is we need to focus sort of less on the military aspects of this, the broader strategic political aspects. Integrating Ukraine into the Euro-Atlantic community is a major strategic victory for the West, no matter what the territorial loss might be, assuming that it's not much larger than the 20% that they've already lost at this point.
Tom, can I also push back on something you suggested before, which is that Putin can sort of, to some extent at least, afford to play it cool with respect to the Ukrainian military presence in Kursk? We can take that back a little bit later, et cetera. Appearing to countenance an invasion of Russia is not something that Western countries would have done during the Cold War. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower, for example, was loath even to provide assistance just to Hungary during the 1956 revolution. And we're not talking about an invasion of Russia. We're just talking about providing assistance to people who are rising up in rebellion. So now we're not just seeing, retroactive, but nonetheless very much Western support for this Ukrainian attack on the Kursk region. We've even seen some Western military equipment take part, in this invasion. So might you think that at some point Russia might feel that it needs to do something dramatic to some extent to reestablish deterrence, especially because it's weaker now and more vulnerable in relative terms than it was during the Cold War, and no one invaded Russia during the Cold War, after all. We've already seen, for example, President Putin and Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov, talk about potentially revising Russia's nuclear doctrine. Is that something that's going to do the trick? What do you think?
In restoring deterrence? Deterrence does exist at this point. There are certain things that we haven't done, in part because we're concerned about Russia's nuclear capabilities and under what circumstances they might use them. I agree wholeheartedly with Eugene. Just because we think we've crossed red lines doesn't mean that red lines don't exist. In fact, the interesting thing about them is that these aren't red lines that have necessarily been announced by Moscow. These are red lines that we've posited in our own imagination by reading sort of the tea leaves of what Putin has said, what other Russian officials have said. So I think we always need to be cautious about that. And the Biden administration has been. We have said repeatedly that we are not prepared to put boots on the ground to defend Ukraine. There is no, NATO as an institution, the United States in particular, has made it quite clear that we're not prepared to go to war to defend a war with Russia to defend Ukraine. So we are deterred in some way. The Russians also clearly deterred. If you look at the way they've conducted this campaign up to this point, they've never gone against the transshipment points of weapons into Ukraine. They have limited the geographic extent of this conflict, at least the active military aspect of it, to Ukrainian territory. I don't think Putin believes that he needs to do something dramatic to reverse what the Ukrainians have done in Kursk. He needs to continue to grind away on the ground in eastern Ukraine and always keep open the possibility of closing off that salient in Kursk sometime in the future. But it's not something that he feels under immediate pressure to do.
Gene, let me turn to you and ask a question about the U.S.-Ukrainian partnership, because by invading Russia proper, Ukraine seems to have taken a page out of the Israeli playbook here, which is that it's better to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission when doing something. Now, so given how dependent the U.S. is on its allies and partners, Washington was never going to throw Kyiv under the bus, and it had little choice but to signal its support once the incursion of the Kursk region was underway, even if it hadn't been informed of Ukraine's plans to invade beforehand. Is that a sign at all of a White House that has lost control of this war?
Well, I guess if the implicit premise of your question is that we control Ukraine, I think that, I would disagree with that. I don't think the White House has ever had any illusions about controlling Ukraine and sort of managing this war from Washington with a long screwdriver, kind of directing operations and whatnot. In fact, we've seen in public significant disagreements between senior Ukrainian commanders and our senior military officers about the conduct of the 2023 Ukrainian offensive, about the way it should have been done, about the way it was done, and the lessons and so on. So I'm not surprised that the White House was perhaps unaware of this planned operation. I don't necessarily detect a major gap developing between Kyiv and Washington as a result of the Kursk operation. There's clearly a lot of coordination. There's clearly, one side, Kyiv, that is hugely dependent on Washington. But again, it does not imply Washington's ownership of Kyiv and this kind of puppet-like manipulation in this situation or any other situation during the war.
Certainly. Well, Tom, do you think that the United States has developed, nonetheless, a type of relationship with Ukraine in which Kyiv retains a significant amount of reverse influence, in which the client, to some extent, has some influence to wield vis-a-vis the patron? That there's a relationship of dependence there, and that therefore the United States is somewhat, by definition, consciously taking risks, in this war effort. And one could even argue that a degree of risk-taking is necessary, to demonstrate Western resolve to the Kremlin and to have a degree of deterrence there as well, to keep Moscow on its toes. What do you think of all that?
In any type of relationship between a major power and a minor power, an alliance type of relationship, the minor power does have certain agency, which it exercises from time to time. You've already pointed to Israel, which has done this with exquisite skill over the past decades, and Ukraine is doing a little bit of this as well. We are in broad agreement on what the goals are. As Gene has already pointed out, there is extensive consultation between the two sides. We are providing advice of all sorts. We don't necessarily always agree with what the Ukrainians do. At the end of the day, they get to decide how to run the operation on the ground, and we've given them tremendous leeway in doing that. They surprise us from time to time, and under the circumstances, we are going to offer public support to what they're doing. That is part, I think, of deterring Russia and demonstrating that if Putin thinks that he can drive a wedge between Kyiv and Washington, between Kyiv and the NATO alliance, that he's not going to succeed in that regard. And that's just the way it's going to continue in the future. I think it's clear that Ukraine would like to see more support from the West, more support from the United States, and the type of equipment that we're providing, in particular, easing the restrictions we placed on the weaponry that we supply them. And at the end of the day, they're not opposed to having boots on the ground, if that's what it takes. So there'll always be some sort of tension between Kyiv and Washington. Kyiv has an interest in escalating this conflict, making it appear as dire from the standpoint of Western interests as possible, and we have an interest in sort of deterring the Ukrainians from going too far, and that takes place behind closed doors the way it should.
Is there any type of action that could theoretically drive a significant wedge between Kyiv and Washington? I know we have an interest in demonstrating to Putin that there is no wedge that can be driven, but is there something that could cross that threshold?
Not. I believe that is possible in the near term, given the resources Ukraine has, the capabilities that Ukraine has. So I would imagine, again, you'll see this. It's a difficult relationship. It has to be managed with care, but both sides understand that they are tied to one another, and they're not going to break that knot at this point.
Got it. We have a question from Lloyd Meadows, and he asks, has the Ukrainian army's organizational structure, with brigades being the largest independent military formation with no divisions, corps, or armies, contributed to challenges in operational command? Has the lack of divisional or corps command structures resulted in senior commanders controlling matters that would be best handled closer to the front lines? And should NATO be assisting with establishing conventional military command structures in addition to training infantry? I know neither of you is a military expert primarily, but if either of you wants to weigh in, okay, we'll leave that for another time.
Pass.
Okay, gotcha.
I think you should get someone like Mike Kaufman or Rob Lee or somebody to offer their thoughts on the subject.
Very good. We've had Mike a couple of times here before, and he's been fantastic for us as well. Second question, which is a little bit more on the political side, and a good segue into the final segment of our panel. Excuse me. According to media reports, Washington is apparently ready to give Ukraine permission to use U.S. weapons to strike military and energy infrastructure deep inside Russian territory. Could that step be enough to force Russia to come to the negotiating table and end the war? Do we think? Gene, you first, then Tom.
Short answer is no, I don't think so. There's an excellent article by, I think, Tom, your colleague, Steve Biddle. I think he is at CFR also, in Foreign Affairs just a few days ago about long-range strikes, and he's got some really interesting, I think, insights into what this might mean or might not mean for the course of this war. But I would say that, in order to really inflict enough damage on Russia to force Putin's hand by way of kind of damaging badly the Russian economy, you'd need to conduct a massive bombing campaign. And again, as Steve Biddle writes, previous massive bombing campaigns have not really been successful during World War II, during the war in Vietnam, in affecting the will of the adversary, so that the adversary would surrender or sue for peace. In this instance, Ukraine has already conducted a number of long-range strikes. Just even in the past few days, they conducted strikes, depending on what you mean by long range. But I think there was a strike at Kyiv, there was a strike in Moscow, captured vividly on YouTube. Was it on X? So Ukraine has developed its own weapons, for long-range strikes. They probably could use more. But again, I don't see that as really affecting Russia's ability to conduct this war. And if anything, I would say it is likely, to my mind, to kind of stiffen the resolve of the Russian public to support Putin, to view Ukraine as the enemy. I recall seeing some months ago footage of Russian women from the Belgrade region. People there are not probably in rural areas terribly sophisticated, don't watch a lot of news on the internet, so they watch a lot of Russian TV, and they're asking, why are these Ukrainians striking at us? What have we done to them? So this kind of attitude, I think, is likely, or a certain risk that could be reinforced among the Russian public. Not that it's really materially affecting Putin's ability to conduct the war either way. I think he's full of resolve to keep this going until he accomplishes his goals.
Got it. Now, let me add an additional question to throw in there for you, Tom, from the audience, from Christian Mehta. She says that President Putin was, at least to some extent, not opposed to Ukraine's EU accession before the war started. That may or may not be true. We do remember the whole crisis in 2014, and that was just over an association agreement with the European Union, to say nothing of full-blown membership. But nonetheless, the point made here by our audience member is that the primary concern was of Ukraine's membership in NATO, not in the European Union. So why should we view EU accession as a victory for Ukraine or for the collective West? I suppose it wasn't really on the table prior to 2022, but nonetheless, go ahead.
Well, again, this is part of Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration, moving closer to the EU and eventual membership in the EU, a reorientation of its economy, its trade relations to the West. But this will also take place in a context in which the West is continuing to provide military assistance to Ukraine, financial assistance to Ukraine. As I said, NATO membership is a question we can discuss if you would like, but there will be some sort of security guarantees for Ukraine, perhaps not the Article 5 that Ukraine aspires to at this point, but some longer-term commitment. We have all these bilateral security agreements now that, if properly funded, provide close defense and military security cooperation for Kyiv for at least a decade. And perhaps longer than that. So I think this is an important part of the puzzle, and is part of the long-term process, not only when we think about Ukraine, but of when we think more broadly about European security and what we would like Europe to look like over the long term. So making Ukraine a part of that broader European structure, I also think it should be a strategic goal for the West, for the United States in particular.
If I may just jump in on this, Zach, very briefly, as I recall, in 2013 and early 2014, Ukraine's drive toward not membership in NATO, but to sign the association agreement with NATO in the fall of 2013 encountered very stiff Russian opposition. Putin basically bribed Yanukovych at the time with a loan of some $15 billion, if my memory serves me right, to walk away from the association agreement. And it's the prospect of EU membership, I think, at the time that really eventually led, to the occupation of Crimea and the start of the undeclared war in eastern Ukraine. So I think Ukrainian membership in the EU would be a major reversal for Russian interests there.
And for its civilizational discourse as well, one would presume. All right. Tom, let me follow up on this with a sort of question of my own. Ukraine has taken major strides toward wresting its domestic politics away from Russian control after its revolution of dignity in 2014. And then early in 2022, after Russia's full-scale invasion, it notched some major victories. I mean, most importantly, it managed to preserve its sovereignty and independence. It foiled the Russian assault on Kyiv. But it also, for the first time, managed to obtain, at the very least, a nominal pathway toward EU membership, which wasn't really on the table between 2014 and 2022 because the Eastern Partnership was about aligning Ukraine with European standards, but it didn't necessarily carry with it the promise of membership. Now we've got candidate status for Ukraine. Do you think that Kyiv is, to some extent, because of the incentive structure that you mentioned before, it has an incentive to escalate to some extent and to draw the West in and to escalate this conflict? Is Kyiv risking some of those hard-fought political gains with this military strategy or the military incentive structure that it seems intent on pursuing?
To a certain extent, yes. But even more broadly than that, the intense focus on the conflict itself, understandable, is going to divert energy and attention from the types of reforms that you need to undertake both on the economic and political side to move forward on EU accession. Under any circumstances, it's going to be a long and arduous process for Ukraine. To my mind, I mean, what Kyiv should be doing at this point, which is belied by what it's doing in Kursk, is trying to draw a solid defensive line to prevent further Russian movement westward into Ukraine, with support from the West to provide as adequate or as best it can the air defenses that protect critical infrastructure, protect major cities, that create conditions. And when you can think about economic reconstruction, when economic reform begins to make sense, when political reform begins to make sense. So I would see if I were the advisor, I would be advising a different strategy at this point. The focus really should be on creating the conditions that allow you to move forward on EU accession, that allow you to establish firmer security and military ties to Western countries as a way of sort of making progress on that strategical integration, full integration into the Euro-Atlantic community.
Can I just make one point on this? Let's not forget that Ukraine did not start this war, and it has no alternative to fighting it. And the problem, as I see it, or a part of the problem here, is that there's just no evidence to suggest that Putin is prepared to end it. So it's very difficult for Ukraine to focus on something other than the conduct of this war and turn its as a nation turn its attention to European integration.
Okay, so let me follow up directly with that on that topic with Eugene, because we hear often that Ukraine should not agree to a ceasefire because Russia might simply invade again sometime down the road, or there's no trust on either side, which I can fully appreciate. But the fact is, Russia is invading now, and they're wreaking havoc now. And the longer the war goes on, as Tom alluded to, the more it does come at a huge cost to Ukraine's long-term prospects for human development, for economic development, etc. So in your view, Gene, what's it going to take for all those potential costs for Ukraine to begin to outweigh the perceived necessity of continuing to fight, both in the minds of the Ukrainian elite, but also the Ukrainian population?
At the risk of repeating myself, again, I don't know. I think Ukraine is fighting to exhaustion. With the winter season, upon us soon, we don't know how the government of Ukraine, the business community will be able to handle the loss of a very significant portion of the country's generation capacity and what toll it will take on the general public. And how many Ukrainians will choose to stay, or how many of them will choose to leave. Because if there's no heat, there's no running water, there's no basic, there are no basic services, then how do you survive in that situation? And I don't know what that will mean for the country's ability to continue to prosecute this war. So there's that very dire situation that's staring at us. And I don't see anything on the other side that would deter Putin from continuing his murderous campaign of indiscriminate bombing, as we tragically saw today. And it is a deliberate campaign to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure and make the country unlivable for the majority of the population. So probably people in rural areas will survive, but major cities, I don't know how they will survive, and that will affect again the ability of the country to sustain it. I don't really have a clear sense of how and where it is going under the current circumstances. But to come back to the point where you started this question, that this is a security, rephrasing that rather, this is, if there is a ceasefire or some kind of even truce, I don't believe that it is going to settle permanently the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, because one of the really dire consequences of Putin's action in starting this full-scale war is that it's not only a crime, but it's also a blunder. He has turned the country that was not an enemy of Russia into an enemy of Russia on Russia's doorstep. And the threat to Russia's physical security now, external threat, is demonstrated by the incursion in Kursk. That's part of the Russian heartland. And to see part of the territory captured by a foreign army is something that Russians, beyond Putin, next generation of Russian leaders, are not going to tolerate. So we have this new permanent standoff between Ukraine and Russia, and I don't know how that is solved. So for Ukraine, the imperative will be to arm itself and prepare itself so that it is able to defend and deter the next round of Russian aggression.
On the question, Tom, of a ceasefire, I fully acknowledge that a ceasefire is very different from a political settlement. But there were reports that the two parties were prepared. I don't know with what mandate and from whom necessarily, but were prepared to sit down in Qatar and to discuss some kind of a partial ceasefire, at least when it comes to targeting critical infrastructure, and that those talks were scuttled by Ukraine's incursion into Kursk. So, how do we get a signal really of whether certain actions by one party or the other strengthens their hand at the negotiating table versus scuttling talks altogether? Are there signals we can try to decipher?
The signals are very hard to decipher at this point, but we're a long way from any serious negotiations at this point. I think Eugene is absolutely right, and be clear that I agree with him that Ukraine didn't start this fight. It doesn't have any choice but to continue, in part because its national survival is at stake. Where we might differ is what we believe the appropriate tactics and strategy for Ukraine are at this point in dealing with the Russian military onslaught. Putin has no reason to desist from this operation at this point. As we've already discussed, no elite or popular pressure to do so. If anything, the incursion into Kursk has probably stiffened the spine. And it's not that that the Russian public is going, or the elite is going to say, well, if we hadn't invaded Ukraine, we could hold on to Kursk. It will be Ukrainians invading Kursk, and we need to defend our territory. And that will rally support behind Putin rather than erode support going forward. If you could reach a ceasefire, the question is what you do with during a ceasefire. Here, Ukraine would have no choice, even under those conditions, to continue to build its military, modernize and expand its military-industrial complex so that it has the equipment it needs for future conflict. You would want to strengthen the ties you have with the Western world on the security side, and you would want to undertake what you need to do on EU accession. Again, to come back to a point that I'd made, the reason that air defense is so important to Ukraine is to limit the damage that Russia can do from this aerial onslaught that we've seen over the past couple of years. They need much more. Zelensky has made that point repeatedly. I do believe that the Western world should be more forthcoming providing that type of equipment, whether it's Patriot missiles, F-16s, or other. But again, to use those largely for air defense so that you can create secure zones inside Ukraine where you can begin to think seriously about economic reconstruction while you are holding the line in the east. But nothing, to my mind, would suggest that Ukraine should simply give up on this fight at this point. That is not an option.
I want to ask one last question to you, Tom, that picks up on recent news, but also looks ahead to the future of our relationship with Russia and the future of European security. And it's about the recent prisoner exchange that we saw that freed Evan Gershkovich, among others. Clearly, there are still lines of communications that are operating, at this point between Russia and the West, even if this should not necessarily lead us to get our hopes up when it comes to the prospects of ceasefire negotiations. But what worries me is that even when we do the right thing and we negotiate the release of Russian dissidents, for example, and we stand up for Western values, it even makes it easier under circumstances like that for the Kremlin to paint people like that as Western agents, who are bent on working against Russia's and Russian society's real interests, the enemy within, a fifth column, as it were. So what does that tell us about our ability to repair relations to some extent with Russia over the long term and develop some kind of productive relationship in the interest of continental security? Even when we do the right thing, it seems to be counterproductive to that long-term goal.
Well, much depends on the political circumstances inside Russia itself. It's going to be very difficult to do it, quite frankly, as long as Putin is at the helm of Russia, given his attitudes towards the West, given his goals, given the mission that he has set for himself, which I think goes well beyond what Russia needs for its own national security and runs counter in many ways to the traditional realpolitik and pragmatism that we've seen in Russian foreign policy. From my standpoint, I think you look at the sort of long-term geopolitical configuration that Russia will be facing. And at some point, in order to deal, I think, particularly with China on its southern eastern borders, that Russia indeed believes in a multipolar world, will come to the understanding that its best situation for it going forward is to maintain constructive relations with all the other great powers. That is the United States in particular, but also to a lesser extent Europe as a whole. And so there's a strategic logic that leads back the Kremlin to a realization that it needs to mend relations with the West, not the partnership that we may have aspired to at the very end of the Cold War, but a working normal relationship that allows Russia to act with some autonomy on the strategic stage. That's what I would be looking for, but it's not something that I believe is possible as long as Putin is guiding Russian foreign policy.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you, Eugene. And of course, our hearts go out very much to all the victims of the attack on Poltava that we just saw. That man in the portrait behind me right over there is my third great-grandfather. His name was Zelman Ber Hashinsky. And that portrait of him behind me was taken in New York City after he had emigrated, but he was originally photographed as a younger man in Romny, Ukraine, which is not all that far from Poltava. So, we all have a connection to this place. We feel the suffering of those who are there, but especially those people who are still there and who are in the thick of this. We hope we can have a more peaceful future for all of them and for the continent, for the world as a whole. In the meantime, thank you, Eugene. Thank you, Tom, for joining us today. A real pleasure to talk with you both. I think that our audience has reasons to be both pessimistic and optimistic as a result of the discussion, but nonetheless, they are much better informed now than they were an hour ago. So thank you so much for taking the time. We hope we can host you again. Thanks for being with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, and à la prochaine.
Thank you, Zach.
Thank you, Zach.